A fugitive shelters in a church and starts crying, but a millionaire praying there discovers who she really is. Comment, giving a rating from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The torrential rain hammered against the stained glass windows of the old church when the woman with red eyes and drenched clothes pushed open the heavy wooden doors seeking shelter. Her dark hair clung to her face as she stumbled between the empty pews, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the fear that had consumed her for weeks. At 30 years old, she carried on her shoulders the weight of unjust accusations that had turned her into a fugitive from her own life, always looking over her shoulder, sleeping in different places each night. The sanctuary offered a temporary reprieve from the relentless pursuit that had become her routine. Newspapers plastered her face with sensational headlines, calling her a fraud and a thief, destroying any chance of rebuilding her existence. The woman who had once worked as a respected accountant now hid in the shadows, surviving on the little money she had managed to save before her accounts were frozen. She didn't expect to find anyone in that sacred place at this late hour. At the altar, kneeling in deep prayer, was a man who radiated a magnetic presence even from behind. The imposing silhouette contrasted with the humility of the position, and when he turned around at the sound of her muffled sobs, she was met with the most striking face she had ever seen. Strong features framed aristocratic features, piercing eyes that seemed to see through the soul, and an aura of power that even the simplicity of the moment couldn't completely mask. She immediately recognized him from the pages of business magazines and television shows. He was the most influential businessman in the region, owner of a financial empire built with savvy investments in the stock market and a fortune in assets that included everything from valuable properties to cryptocurrency investments. The millionaire instantly recognized her as the woman the entire city was looking for, the one whose name had become synonymous with financial scandal. The newspapers spoke of multi-million-dollar embezzlements, falsified documents, and a corruption ring that she supposedly led from within an accounting firm. Any sensible person would turn her over to the authorities immediately, earning the favors of justice and society. But something in her desperate gaze touched him in an inexplicable way. It wasn't just despair he saw, but a wounded dignity, a broken pride of someone who had always fought honestly for her life. The rain streamed down her face, mingling with tears she tried to contain, and at that moment he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of calling the police, he offered help. His voice was deep and controlled when he whispered that she could stay until the storm passed. She hesitated, distrustful of any gesture of kindness after weeks of being treated as an outcast. But the cold penetrated to the bone, and exhaustion weighed more than caution. He led her through a side door that led to the priest's quarters, explaining that he had a key because he contributed generously to the church's upkeep. There she found dry clothes left by needy parishioners and a small kitchenette where she could prepare something hot. He remained respectfully outside while she changed, but his presence was still palpable through the door. When she emerged in loose but dry clothes, she found him sitting on a nearby bench, studying her with a disturbing intensity. She murmured an embarrassed "thank you," keeping her distance, but he made a proposal that left her speechless. He offered to hide her on one of his isolated properties, far from prying eyes and relentless pursuit. The offer was too tempting to refuse, but also fraught with dangerous implications. She, a strong and independent woman who had always fought for everything in life, would find herself dependent on the kindness of a powerful stranger. The humiliation of that dependence consumed her, but the alternatives were even worse. Accepting meant putting her life in the hands of someone who had no reason to protect her except for an inexplicable compassion. He sensed her hesitation and offered assurances that sounded sincere. He would demand nothing in return, ask no questions about her guilt or innocence, only offer a safe haven until she could resolve her situation. The tone of his voice carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but also an unexpected gentleness that made her lower her guard slightly. The decision was made when sirens sounded in the distance on the rainy night. She accepted his protection, not knowing that she was taking the first step on a journey that would test all her principles and challenge everything she believed about trust, power, and redemption. When they left the church together through the back door, heading to his luxurious car, parked discreetly on a dark street, neither of them imagined that this chance encounter would trigger a series of revelations that would shake the foundations of their lives and force them to confront truths they preferred to keep buried. The isolated property was 40 minutes from the city, hidden among hills covered in dense vegetation that offered absolute privacy. It was an elegant ranch house, built of natural stone, with large windows that offered panoramic views of the rural landscape during the day. He explained that he used the place for personal retreats when he needed to escape the pressure of business and the social demands of his position. She entered the house with cautious movements, still processing the unreality of the situation. Just hours before, she'd been sleeping in a makeshift shelter under an awning, and now she found herself in a luxurious environment that exuded good taste and understated wealth. The furniture was made of solid wood, the walls decorated with paintings by renowned artists, and every detail revealed the owner's considerable wealth. He showed her the room she could use, a spacious suite on the second floor with a private bathroom and a small balcony overlooking the gardens. The king-size bed was covered with Egyptian cotton sheets, and the closet could easily hold the wardrobe of an entire family. She felt small and out of place in that environment, painfully remembering the modesty of her apartment before her life fell apart. During the first few days, they barely spoke. He left early for his business appointments and returned late, finding only subtle signs of her presence. Dishes washed in the sink, books slightly displaced in the library, curtains opened at different angles. She moved through the house like a ghost, grateful for the generosity, but deeply uncomfortable with the dependence. The routine began to gradually establish itself. She woke up before dawn, made coffee, and took refuge in the library until she heard the sound of his car leaving. Then she timidly explored the house, always careful not to leave traces of her curiosity. The library became her private sanctuary, filled with volumes on philosophy, history, and classical literature that revealed unexpected facets of his personality. One morning, he surprised her in the kitchen, preparing an elaborate coffee with special beans she had found in the pantry. The Italian machine was more sophisticated than any equipment she had ever handled, but she had managed to master its operation. He seemed impressed with the quality of the coffee, making a discreet compliment that made her blush with embarrassment. It was the first of many small moments that began to break the ice between them. Brief conversations about books, comments on news they watched on different channels, observations about the weather or the landscape. She discovered that he possessed a sharp intelligence and a subtle sense of humor that contrasted with his public image as a ruthless businessman. He, in turn, was intrigued by her refined culture and the way she expressed herself on complex subjects. It wasn't what he expected from someone accused of financial crimes. Her opinions on art and literature revealed a solid education and an intellect that impressed him. He began to question silently whether the newspapers were telling the whole truth about her. The forced proximity created a palpable tension that grew with each day. She felt too grateful to show annoyance when he monopolized the television to follow stock market reports, but her wounded pride prevented her from openly thanking him for his hospitality. He noticed how she flinched slightly when their hands touched accidentally when picking up the same object. But he also noticed how her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking. The first disturbing revelation came on a rainy afternoon when she was exploring his home office in search of paper for notes. Among the documents on the desk, she found financial reports from several companies that made up his business empire. A familiar name jumped out at her, making her heart race dangerously. It was the auditing firm that had bought the small accounting firm where she worked 2 years earlier. The same company whose auditors had found the irregularities that destroyed her career and her life. The papers trembled in her hands when she realized that it wasn't a cosmic coincidence, but a direct connection between her benefactor and her ruin. She confronted him that same night when he returned from work and found her waiting in the living room with the documents scattered on the coffee table. His expression changed immediately when he saw the papers, a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like genuine guilt. The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. She accused him of playing with her, of turning his generosity into a cruel form of penance for the crimes of his company. Tears of anger streamed down her face as she demanded explanations, questioning whether all his kindness was nothing more than an elaborate act to ease his conscience. He swore he had no specific knowledge of her case when the audit happened. He explained that he owned dozens of companies and that he delegated operational management to trusted executives, but he admitted that legally he was responsible for all actions committed under his corporate command. The honest confession made him even more attractive in her eyes, which only increased her emotional confusion. Distrust settled between them like an almost physical barrier. She began to watch him with different eyes, looking for signs of falsehood or manipulation. He became more cautious in his interactions, weighing each word before speaking. But the mutual attraction continued to grow, creating a torturous internal conflict for both. During a particularly violent storm, the electricity failed, leaving them in complete darkness. She was reading in the library when the lights went out, and the scare made her drop some heavy books. He appeared quickly with a flashlight, worried about the noise. He found her kneeling on the floor, picking up the volumes, and knelt down to help her. Their hands met on the same book, and for a moment they stood still, looking into each other's eyes in the flickering light of the flashlight. The proximity was intoxicating, and she could feel the heat emanating from his body. For a moment, it seemed like he would lean in to kiss her, but then she pulled away abruptly, muttering an embarrassed excuse. That night marked a definitive change in the dynamic between them. The sexual tension became almost unbearable, permeating every conversation and every shared silence. She began to have disturbing dreams about him, waking up breathless and confused. He began to work even later, avoiding the intimate moments that proximity inevitably created. It was then that she made a decision that would change everything. She would begin to discreetly investigate her own case, determined to discover the truth and clear her name without relying on his help. Using an old laptop she found in a closet, she began researching information about the audit that destroyed her life, looking for inconsistencies and clues that could reveal what had really happened in those dark days. The investigation began in the early hours of the morning, when she was sure he was asleep. The old laptop was slow, but it worked adequately for her needs. She began by revisiting the events that preceded her downfall, looking for details that may have gone unnoticed at the time. The files of the company where she worked had been confiscated by the authorities, but she kept personal copies of some important documents in a forgotten email account. For weeks, she delved into the numbers and reports, reconstructing the chronology of events that led to the fateful audit. What she discovered left her increasingly convinced that she had been the victim of an elaborate trap. The discrepancies in the balance sheets appeared exactly 1 week before the external audit, as if someone knew in advance when the verification would take place. Her routine changed drastically. During the day, she maintained appearances of normality, but at night she transformed into a detective determined to unravel the conspiracy that destroyed her reputation. She discovered that the company's chief accountant, an ambitious man referred to only as the supervisor in her notes, had assumed increasing responsibilities in the months leading up to the scandal. A disturbing discovery came when she managed to access old internal communication records from the company through a former colleague who still maintained discreet contact. The messages revealed that the supervisor had requested special access to her files weeks before the audit, claiming a need to review procedures. At the time, she didn't question the request, trusting the company hierarchy. Meanwhile, the tension with her protector intensified dangerously. He began to notice her nocturnal habits, the dark circles that appeared in the morning, the way she looked away when he asked casual questions about how she had spent the night. The mutual distrust created a charged atmosphere that made each interaction an emotional minefield. One morning, he found her asleep over the laptop in the library, surrounded by papers scribbled with numbers and notes. She woke with a start as she felt his presence, quickly closing the laptop in a reaction that left him visibly irritated. For the first time since bringing her home, he showed genuine impatience, demanding to know what she was hiding. The ensuing argument was more intense than the previous one. He argued that he had the right to know what was happening under his roof, especially if she was doing something that could compromise both of their safety. She retorted, accusing him of wanting to control her life in the same way he controlled his businesses, using power to obtain information that didn't belong to him. The exchange of accusations revealed deep wounds in both of them. He admitted that his need for control came from past betrayals in business, situations where his excessive trust resulted in huge financial losses. She confessed that her distrust was the result of years of being underestimated and manipulated by authority figures who saw her kindness as weakness. The moment of greatest tension came when she accused him of keeping her prisoner in a gilded cage, using her gratitude as a tool of control. He replied that the only thing preventing her from leaving was her own cowardice, her inability to face the real world and fight for her innocence. The words cut deeply, and she left the library with tears of humiliation in her eyes. That night, she decided to leave. She packed her few possessions into a borrowed backpack and left a letter on the kitchen table, thanking him for his hospitality, but explaining that she could not continue living in dependence and distrust. She was walking along the dark road towards the city when his car headlights reached her. He stopped the vehicle and got out, approaching her with an anguished expression. He apologized for the harsh words, admitting that he spoke out of frustration and not out of real conviction. He explained that the idea of seeing her leave despaired him in a way he couldn't fully understand. She hesitated, torn between her wounded pride and the recognition that she also didn't want to separate from him. What convinced her to return was when he offered to help in the investigation she had been conducting secretly. He promised to use his business resources and contacts to uncover the truth, even if it meant exposing flaws in his own organization. The proposal was tempting, but also dangerous, as it would put them working side by side in a search that could reveal inconvenient truths for both. During the following days, they became unlikely partners in an investigation that proved more complex than they imagined. He used his influence to gain access to old corporate documents, while she applied her accounting expertise to identify suspicious patterns. The forced collaboration broke down many of the emotional barriers between them, but it also created new types of tension. Working together until late at night, sharing discoveries and theories, they developed an intellectual intimacy that was almost as intoxicating as the obvious physical attraction between them. She was impressed by his analytical capacity and his willingness to question practices in his own companies. He admired her persistence and the meticulous way she built her arguments based on evidence. The first major discovery came when they were able to track suspicious financial transfers that occurred at the time of the audit. The embezzled money had not disappeared, but had been transferred to a shell account that belonged to a front company. The account holder was the supervisor, But the discovery revealed something even more shocking. He wasn't acting alone. The bank record showed regular deposits coming from an external source, payments that seemed like rewards for services rendered. When they managed to identify the origin of these payments, they discovered that they came from a person much closer to her than they had ever imagined. The account that financed the supervisor's corruption belonged to her childhood best friend, the only person she still completely trusted after the scandal. The revelation was devastating. The woman who had grown up by her side, who knew all her secrets and insecurities, who had offered emotional support during the early days of the crisis, was actually the architect of her destruction. The bank transfers revealed a pattern of payments that began months before the audit, suggesting meticulous and cold planning. Confronted with the evidence through a recorded phone call, the traitorous friend finally confessed. The motivation was a toxic mixture of envy and ambition. She had always resented the protagonist's professional success, her emotional stability, her ability to inspire respect without having to manipulate people. The opportunity to destroy all of this while enriching herself through the scheme with the supervisor was irresistible. The confession revealed cruel details about how the betrayal was executed. The friend had provided personal information that allowed the supervisor to forge convincing evidence, intimate knowledge about work routines, and access passwords that made the falsification almost perfect. She had even suggested the ideal time to plant the evidence, knowing that the protagonist was distracted by family problems. The discovery of this double betrayal was more devastating than all the public accusations combined. It completely shook her faith in humanity and in the possibility of genuinely trusting anyone. She locked herself in the room for 2 days, refusing food and ignoring his attempts to offer comfort. The pain of the discovery was physical, an open wound that bled with every memory of happy moments shared with someone she considered a sister. The silence that followed the discovery of the betrayal was broken only by the persistent sound of her door being gently knocked on. He had respected her isolation for 2 days, leaving trays of food that remained untouched outside the room. But now his voice crossed the wood with a determination she had never heard before. They weren't empty words of comfort, but a firm statement that he wouldn't allow her to destroy herself because of the wickedness of others. When she finally opened the door, she found him holding a thick envelope that would change everything. Inside were legal documents that he had prepared during her seclusion, a complete confession from the supervisor obtained in exchange for not being criminally prosecuted, and more importantly, detailed bank records that proved the entire corruption scheme. He had worked tirelessly with lawyers and private investigators to build an irrefutable case of her innocence. But there was a terrible price for this liberation. Revealing the truth publicly would mean admitting that his company had ruined an innocent person, exposing serious flaws in the internal control systems he oversaw. His business reputation, built over decades, would be permanently tarnished. Investors would lose confidence, contracts would be cancelled, and a considerable portion of his fortune in shares could disappear in a matter of days. She studied the documents with trembling hands, barely believing that her liberation was finally within reach. But the understanding of the sacrifice he would make for her left her even more emotionally confused. Why would a man who barely knew her risk everything for her redemption? The question tormented her because the obvious answer was something she was not yet ready to accept or reciprocate. The final decision came during a conversation that lasted all night in the library. He explained that his wealth would have no meaning if it was built on the injustice that destroyed her life. He admitted that the feelings he had developed for her were not just compassion, but something much deeper and more disturbing. He was in love with a woman who might never completely trust him, and this realization forced him to choose between his financial security and his moral integrity. She tried to dissuade him, arguing that her life was already destroyed and that it was not worth him sacrificing everything for someone that society would always see as tainted by scandal. But he replied that he would rather be a less wealthy and morally upright man than a millionaire who allowed an injustice to remain uncorrected. The statement moved her deeply, awakening feelings that she had been struggling to suppress. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning. He spent the dawn reviewing his statement while she remained by his side, alternating between overwhelming gratitude and devastating guilt for the price he would pay. When she finally fell asleep on the library sofa, exhausted by the emotional tension, he gently covered her with a blanket and remained watching her for long minutes, engraving in his memory an image that could be one of the last of intimacy between them. The public revelation caused the expected earthquake. He took full responsibility for the mistakes of his company, made public apologies, and announced complete structural changes to internal audit systems. The financial market reacted immediately, with shares in his companies plummeting and several business partners suspending contracts. In a matter of hours, he lost a significant percentage of his investment assets and saw his reputation as an infallible businessman publicly collapse. But something unexpected happened in the following days. The courage to admit the mistakes and correct a historical injustice won the respect of important sectors of society. Civil rights organizations praised his integrity, and some visionary investors saw the crisis as an opportunity to bet on a leader who put principles above profit. His fortune remained significant, although reduced, but his personal reputation began to rebuild on a more solid foundation. For her, the change was even more dramatic. With her name officially cleared and irrefutable evidence of her innocence, she was able to emerge from the shadows and rebuild her professional identity. Job offers arrived from companies that valued her experience and admired her resilience during the months of unjust persecution. The media that had once demonized her now celebrated her story of overcoming and dignity. But the biggest challenge came from their own relationship. With the external obstacles removed, they found themselves confronted with the reality of their mutual feelings and the complications that this represented. She felt simultaneously grateful and embarrassed by the emotional debt she could never fully repay. He struggled against the feeling that any demonstration of affection on her part could be motivated more by gratitude than by genuine love. The tension reached its limit one night when she announced her intention to leave and start a new life in a distant city. She argued that she needed to prove to herself that she could rebuild her existence independently, without his shadow of protection looming over every achievement. The prospect of losing her, after everything they had been through together, despaired him in a way he couldn't hide. The discussion that followed was the most honest and raw they had ever had. He confessed that he loved her with an intensity that frightened him, that every day by her side had become more precious than all his material possessions. She admitted that she loved him too, but feared that her feelings were contaminated by gratitude and the emotional dependence created by the extraordinary circumstances that united them. The decisive moment came when she asked if he would be able to love her if she were really guilty of the crimes she was accused of. The question caught him off guard, forcing him to examine the true nature of his feelings. After a long and agonizing pause, he replied that his first attraction had not been to the wronged innocent, but to the strong woman he found crying in a church, someone who maintained dignity even in despair. The answer broke the last emotional barrier between them. She realized that what she felt was not just gratitude, but genuine love for a man who chose to do what was right, even when it cost him dearly. He understood that his passion was not for a victim who needed to be saved, but for a woman who faced adversity with courage and never lost her essence. The kiss that followed was inevitable, charged with months of repressed tension and denied feelings. It was not a moment of unbridled passion, but of mutual recognition, of two people who finally allowed themselves to be vulnerable without fear of judgment or rejection. The intimacy that developed that night was built on solid foundations of respect, admiration, and love, tested by adversity. The following months brought challenges of a different kind. The society that had once seen them as protector and protected now judged them as an unlikely couple, questioning the motivations of both. But they faced the criticism together, supporting each other as they rebuilt their professional and personal lives. She accepted a leadership position at an ethical auditing firm, while he restructured his business with a focus on transparency and social responsibility. A year after the fortuitous meeting at the church, they returned to the sacred place where it all began. This time, not as a desperate fugitive and her reluctant savior, but as two people who discovered that true love could blossom even in the most barren soil of adversity. The ceremony was simple and intimate, witnessed only by a few true friends who remained loyal during the storms. As they exchanged vows under the same stained-glass windows that witnessed their first meeting, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that brought them there. They had lost much along the way, their innocence about human nature, their old certainties about trust and power, but gained something much more valuable. The understanding that the true worth of a person was not in their wealth or reputation, but in the courage to do what was right when everything was at stake, and in the ability to love despite all the reasons not to trust.